If you had asked me a year ago what my life would look like now, I would have painted you a picture of certainty, a house with a little garden, Sunday dinners at the table, a man by my side who made me feel secure. For so long, I believed I had all the pieces lined up. Chris and I, but it was ours. I can still see the dent in the wall by the front door. My clumsy attempt to wedge a bookshelf inside one rainy afternoon. Chris laughed at me for a week, then forgot it ever happened. But I never did. That dent became something I promised myself I would fix before we moved into the house we always talked about. A house. It wasn't just a dream. It felt inevitable. That's how we lived back then. Chris brought the color and I brought the structure. I was the one with a steady job in software development, the one who tracked bills, remembered birthdays, kept our little world in motion. I didn't mind. I actually liked being the anchor. Chris was the free spirit. That's what he called himself, an ocean that could not be contained. At first it charmed me. He'd wake me at 2 a.m, insisting we drive out to the lake just to watch the stars. He'd spend entire weekends painting, disappearing into canvases splattered with colors I couldn't name. He'd book trips on a whim and convince me with just a grin to follow. I thought we balanced each other perfectly. He pulled me into chaos. I gave him stability. For years that dance worked, but lately I could feel the rhythm breaking. Chris's spontaneity wasn't charming anymore, it was an excuse. He'd vanish for nights, not answering calls, coming home smelling of beer and smoke. His texts got shorter, sharper. Whenever I asked what was wrong, he'd roll his eyes, wave a dismissive hand, and mutter, "Brenda, you overthink everything. Can't you just let things be?" That answer used to sting. Now it chilled me. Because I realized something I wasn't overthinking. I was seeing what was right in front of me. The warmth between us had thinned to a ghost of itself. The man I used to fall asleep beside now felt like a stranger in the same bed. The dent in the wall near the door, once a silly memory, had started to look like a warning. A crack I ignored until one day the whole foundation would crumble. I tried to shake it off. We'd been through rough patches before, but each night the silence grew heavier like fog filling the apartment. I cooked dinner. He came home late. I asked about his day. He answered with a shrug. I suggested a weekend trip. He said he was too busy, then disappeared again. And still, I clung to the idea that stability could save us, that if I just stayed steady, Chris would come back to himself. But deep down, a question started to claw at me. What if he didn't want to come back? The first time suspicion truly took root was subtle. One evening, Chris stepped out onto the balcony to take a call. I wasn't eavesdropping, but the walls were thin. His voice was soft, a tone I hadn't heard directed at me in months. He laughed an easy, unguarded laugh that made my stomach knot. When he came back in, I asked who was that. He shrugged, pouring himself a drink. Just a friend. I wanted to press, but the hard look in his eyes warned me off. He was daring me to challenge him, and I didn't have the strength. Not yet. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was already losing him. Not to distance, not to stress, but to someone else. Late one night, lying awake while Chris snored beside me, I thought about that dent in the wall again. I remembered how frustrated I'd been when I first made it, how I promised myself I'd fix it before we moved. And yet here we were, months later, the dent still there. A flaw I walked past every day, pretending it didn't matter. What if my relationship was just like that wall? Something broken. I kept telling myself yet I'd repair, even as it deepened into something unfixable. The thought stayed with me, heavy and unrelenting. Then came the moment I couldn't ignore anymore. I was at work when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Marcus, a colleague who rarely texted me outside office hours. Attached was a screenshot, a photo of Chris taken at a crowded bar, his head tilted back in laughter, his arm draped around a woman's shoulder. A caption overlaid, "Finally found a soul that speaks my language." The woman was Maya, a friend of ours, or so I thought. She had been orbiting Chris for months, a self-proclaimed poet with an endless stream of deep Instagram posts. Chris had mentioned her more and more lately, praising her brilliance, her energy. I brushed it off as harmless admiration. Until that moment. I stared at the picture, the bracelet on Chris's wrist catching the light. My bracelet, the one I had given him for his birthday. The room spun around me. Marcus's text followed. "I thought you should see this before it gets worse." I didn't reply. I didn't scream. I didn't even cry. Instead, a numbness washed over me, the kind that hollows you out, leaves you standing there like a shell. Because in that instant, the truth was undeniable. Chris wasn't drifting. He wasn't lost in his art. He wasn't struggling through a rough patch. He was already gone. And he hadn't even bothered to tell me. The next few days blurred into each other. I went through the motions at work, smiled when spoken to, answered emails. But at night, lying awake in the apartment that felt less and less like mine, the hollow truth echoed louder. The dent in the wall by the door was the first crack. This photo was the flood. And deep inside, I knew the collapse was coming. When the first photo surfaced, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just a bad angle, a friendly moment taken out of context. Chris was impulsive, affectionate with friends. Surely it wasn't what it looked like. But lies have a way of collapsing under their own weight. A week later, another screenshot found its way to me, this time without any ambiguity. It was Maya again. A close-up this time. Her hand laced with Chris's, their fingers tangled like roots that had been growing for a long time. On her wrist was the bracelet I'd given him. On his face, the kind of smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. The caption was worse than the image finally found my soulmate. The kind of love you can't fake. My heart clenched, then went strangely still. I couldn't even summon rage. Just a deep, sick hollowness. Like realizing the person you've been sleeping beside has already been replaced, and you were the last one to notice. That night I didn't confront him. Not yet. I wanted to see if he would tell me the truth. I wanted to know if there was still a sliver of decency left in him. So I waited. The clock ticked past 11 when the sound of keys scraping at the lock finally broke the silence. The door creaked open. Chris stumbled in, humming a tune under his breath, smelling faintly of cheap beer and perfume that wasn't mine. He tossed his keys onto the little table by the door. The sound echoed in the quiet apartment like a gunshot. I was already sitting on the couch, lights off, just the pale glow of the street lamp painting my face in shadows. His humming stopped when his eyes adjusted and he saw me. "Oh," he said, startled. His voice tightened. "You're still up?" "Yeah," I answered evenly. Couldn't sleep. Chris hesitated, then sauntered into the living room, dropping onto the far end of the couch. 10 feet of space stretched between us, wider than any ocean he liked to compare himself to. The silence pressed down, heavy, unrelenting. Finally, I asked, "Is everything okay, Chris?" He let out a long theatrical sigh, the kind that always made me feel small. "Brenda, what's with you lately? You're so heavy, always serious." I kept my voice calm, though my hands trembled in my lap. I just asked a question. He finally turned his head. His eyes weren't soft. They were cold, resigned, like someone who'd already chosen their path. "Look, I can't do this anymore," he said. His tone was flat, cruel in its finality. "You're safe, predictable. That's not what I want. I need passion, excitement, and honestly, you don't have that in you." The words should have broken me. A month ago, maybe they would have. But tonight, they just confirmed what I already knew. I stared at him, really seeing him, this man who had once promised me forever, now sitting there discarding me like yesterday's news. "And who gives you this excitement?" I asked softly. "Is it Maya?" For a flicker of a second, his face betrayed him. Shock, panic. Then just as quickly, arrogance slid back into place. He smirked. "She understands me," he said, voice swelling with self-righteousness. "She's wild, an artist, everything you're not." I didn't cry. I didn't yell. My heart was pounding, but my voice stayed level. "And she's your muse." His eyes widened. He hadn't expected me to know. For a moment, his bravado cracked. But then he leaned forward, lips curling into a cruel smile. "You're not a good person, Brenda," he sneered. "A good person would be happy for me. Happy that I found my soulmate." The words hit harder than any slap. Not because they were true, they weren't, but because of the audacity. He had betrayed me, humiliated me, replaced me. And now he was twisting the knife, framing my pain as proof of my own failure. For a long moment, the silence between us was unbearable. I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock, the distant rumble of traffic outside, even the rush of blood in my ears. I stood up slowly, not trusting myself to speak. Chris frowned. "What are you doing?" I walked into the bedroom and pulled a bag from the closet. My laptop, my wallet, a few changes of clothes. The essentials. When I returned, he was still on the couch, confusion giving way to panic. "Brenda," he said sharply, "don't be dramatic. I just told you what's going on. We can talk about this later." "There's nothing to talk about," I said, zipping the bag. My voice was steady, almost eerily calm. "You've made your choice. Now I'm making mine." I slung the bag over my shoulder and walked to the door. "Wait!" His voice rose, tinged with desperation now. "You can't just leave. Not like this." I paused with my hand on the doorknob. I hope you and your soulmate have a wonderful life together, I said quietly. Then I stepped out, closing the door behind me. The click of the latch was final. Behind me, I left the silence, the dent in the wall, and the man who had taught me what betrayal really feels like. I didn't look back. The night I left Chris, I carried only one bag. It was light, but the weight pressing on my chest was crushing. I had given years of my life to him, and all I took with me were clothes, my laptop, and a passport. Everything else stayed behind the furniture. I picked the curtains, I sewed, even the dent in the wall that had once felt like a harmless joke. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't stay. For the first few weeks, I slept on my friend Nadia's couch. She didn't ask questions, just handed me a blanket and a pillow the night I showed up at her door. Her quiet kindness was exactly what I needed. The silence in her apartment was different from the silence with Chris. It wasn't heavy or suffocating. It was soft, healing. I could breathe again. I threw myself into work. At the office, I was the first to arrive, the last to leave. My manager, David, noticed the change. Instead, I built new frameworks, cleaned old code, fixed problems that had been sitting untouched for months. My work became a lifeline, something steady when the rest of my life felt like shifting sand. At night, exhaustion replaced sorrow. For the first time in months, I slept soundly. But recovery is never a straight line. Every so often, I would wake in Nadia's spare room with the phantom memory of Chris's laugh in my ears, or I'd reach for my phone, expecting a text from him. Then I'd remember he wasn't mine to expect anything from anymore. That thought hurt less each day. Pain dulled, then hardened into resolve. After a month, I signed the lease on a small one-bedroom apartment. It wasn't much a cracked tile in the bathroom, a stubborn window that refused to stay open, but it was mine, entirely mine. I painted the walls pale green, strung fairy lights across the balcony, and bought a plant I had no idea how to take care of. For the first time, I felt the thrill of building a space without compromise. No one else's taste, no one else's chaos. Just mine. I hung shelves carefully, making sure nothing would leave another dent. I told myself this home would carry no hidden cracks, no quiet warnings ignored. Meanwhile, the world reminded me of Chris in fragments I couldn't control. Through friends of friends, I heard whispers about him and Maya. They were everywhere: coffee shops, art shows, parties. They had become the couple people couldn't stop watching, parading their soulmate romance like a badge of honor. Once Nadia hesitantly showed me a post Maya had uploaded, Chris' arms wrapped around her, her caption dripping with poetry about passion and truth. I stared at the screen for a long time. Not with jealousy, not even with anger. With pity. Because I knew him. I knew the cracks he hid behind charm, the irresponsibility he wrapped in freedom. He wasn't a soulmate. He was a storm, and storms don't stop just because they change the coastline they hit. My life, in contrast, grew quieter, steadier. I signed up for the gym, started running again. I read books before bed instead of waiting for Chris to stumble home. I learned how to enjoy my own company. Some nights, though, when the apartment was too still, doubt crept back in. What if Chris was right? What if I wasn't passionate enough? Exciting enough? What if predictability was all I had to offer? Those thoughts gnawed at me until I remembered his words. You're not a good person. A good person would be happy for me. And suddenly the absurdity of it hit me all over again. The cruelty of blaming me for his betrayal. Each time I replayed that moment, my spine straightened a little more. My resolve deepened. Still, a part of me knew the story wasn't finished. Chris and Maya's whirlwind romance felt too fragile, too performative to last. I didn't need to interfere. Time would do it for me. And when it did, I had a feeling Chris would come looking for me. That thought used to terrify me. Now it only made me stronger. One evening, after a long day at work, I stood on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker against the dark. The air smelled of rain. My apartment was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was peaceful. For the first time in a long while, I felt a strange, tentative joy. I wasn't the woman waiting by the door for someone to come home anymore. I was the woman who had walked away and was still standing. And in the silence, I promised myself I would never let anyone make me doubt my worth again. Whispers of Chris's new life reached me slowly, like echoes carried through strangers. Nadia's friends, co-workers, who moved in the same downtown circles. Even a few old acquaintances I never sought out the news, but somehow it found me. At first, it sounded like they were invincible. Chris and Maya were the it couple of the scene. People gushed about their wild parties, their late-night poetry readings, their endless energy. They posted photos of themselves draped across coffee shop couches at gallery openings, dancing barefoot in the rain. From the outside, it looked like freedom, passion. Everything Chris had thrown in my face the night he left me. But I knew better. I knew storms when I saw them. The cracks started to show within a few months. It began online. Maya's ex-girlfriend posted something cryptic on Instagram, a line about being a muse for a season discarded for a lifetime. In the blanks. One by one, other women added their voices, different names, same story. Chris had a pattern, charm, intensity, devotion, followed by abandonment when the next muse came along. Reading those words, I felt a pang of recognition. Not sorrow, not longing, recognition. Because I had lived that story too. Soon after, rumors about money started swirling. Chris's so-called art career wasn't paying the bills. He was borrowing from friends, leaving tabs unpaid at bars, leaning heavily on Maya's income from teaching part-time workshops. His charisma had always carried him, but charm doesn't settle rent. And then came the spectacle that felt like deja vu. One evening, Nadia shoved her phone into my hands. You need to see this. It was a public post from Chris. His words written with his trademark flair for dramatics. Sometimes the soul must wander. Sometimes we must leave behind love, no matter how real, in order to grow. Maya was my fire, but fires burn out. I found a new light, a new beginning. The photos attached showed him with another woman, younger, smiling wide. His hand tangled in hers beneath the post, some praising his honesty, others tearing him apart. Maya hadn't responded publicly, but within hours, she posted a blurry black and white photo of herself with the caption, "Losing pieces of myself I thought were permanent." My chest tightened as I read it, not because I wanted Chris back, not because I still loved him, but because I remembered exactly what it felt like to be in her place. For days afterward, I caught myself wondering, did she see the truth about him sooner than I had? Or did she ignore the warning signs, too convincing herself the storm was just passion? It didn't matter. The outcome was the same. Chris hadn't found his soulmate. He'd found his mirror. One night, while cleaning my apartment, I stumbled across the old bracelet box, the one I had given him. Empty now, of course. He'd worn it in that photo with Maya, and who knew where it was now? I held the box in my hands and let the memories rush over me. His grin, the night I gave it to him. The way he'd promised forever, the way he'd said, "You ground me, Brenda. You're my anchor." All words, all lies. I closed the box and set it back on the shelf. It was no longer a symbol of loss, but of release. Around this time, my career began to shift upward. David, my manager, pulled me aside after a successful presentation and said, "You've been on fire lately. I think you're ready for something bigger." For the first time, I realized he was right. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. Meanwhile, Chris was imploding. Mutual friends whispered that he had been blacklisted from a few galleries after too many drunken outbursts. His debts were piling and him shattered. And Chris. He was seen less and less until he became a shadow of the man who once called himself an ocean. I should have felt vindicated, and maybe part of me did. But mostly I felt nothing. That was the strangest part. The man who had once consumed my world, who had broken me open with his betrayal, was unraveling, and I couldn't summon more than distant pity. Because the truth was simple, I had already left him behind. Yet a quiet unease lingered. I knew Chris. He wasn't the type to vanish gracefully. His ego wouldn't let him. Sooner or later, when the dust settled, he would look for me. And when that moment came, I would need to be ready. Not with tears, not with anger, but with the strength to face him without flinching. It started with a text. My phone buzzed one evening as I was rinsing dishes. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hey, just saw a picture of our old coffee shop. Hope you're doing well." No name, but I didn't need one. My chest tightened. I deleted it without responding. 2 days later, another message. "I'm sorry for how things ended. I wasn't myself back then." This one I didn't delete right away. I stared at it until the words blurred. I wasn't myself. No. He had been exactly himself, selfish, reckless, cruel. I closed the screen and shoved the phone into a drawer. But Chris wasn't done. The messages kept coming. They swung wildly in tone, casual, apologetic, nostalgic, desperate. "Remember that trip to the lake? I can't stop thinking about it. You're the only one who ever truly understood me. I made a mistake. Please, just one chance to talk." Each ping of my phone felt like an echo from a past I'd buried. I didn't reply. Not once. But silence, I would soon learn, only made him louder. The calls began next. When I didn't answer, he recruited others. One afternoon, my phone lit up with a name I hadn't seen in months, Emily, one of Chris's closest friends. Against my better judgment, I answered. Brenda, she said quickly, I know you don't want to hear from me, but I'm worried about Chris. He's in a bad place. He misses you. I bit my tongue, fighting the old instinct to soothe, to fix. Emily, I'm sorry he's struggling, but that's not my responsibility anymore. She pressed harder, her tone softening into persuasion. He knows he messed up. He says you were the only real thing he ever had. Can't you just talk to him as a friend? My pulse thudded in my ears. I closed my eyes, picturing Chris's smug face the night he told me I wasn't a good person. That memory anchored me. No, I said firmly. If you're truly his friend, tell him to find help on his own. I can't be that for him. Before she could argue, I hung up. Days later, Nadia warned me. He's circling, she said. A few people told me he's asking about you. He's not letting go. I nodded, even though a cold knot twisted in my stomach. I thought I was ready for this. But hearing his name out loud again, hearing that he was searching for me, made old scars itch. Then came the call I wasn't expecting, from my mother. Brenda, she said hesitantly. Chris called me. My heart lurched. What? He said he made a terrible mistake, that he still loves you. He sounded so broken, honey. I thought maybe you should just talk to him for closure. The betrayal stung more than I expected, not from Chris, but from her. My own mother unknowingly becoming his pawn. Mom, I said quietly but firmly, I need you to hear me. I am fine. I've moved on. Chris is not my responsibility. Please don't ever ask me to go back there. She went quiet, then sighed. You're right. He sounded so lost. I swallowed hard. That's not my problem anymore. Still, Chris wasn't finished. One evening, an unknown number flashed on my phone. Against my better judgment, I answered. Brenda, his voice rasped, raw and broken. Please, I need to see you. I made a mistake. She used me. Everything I said before, it was a lie. I was stupid. Please, just talk to me. The sound of his desperation should have cracked me. Once it would have. But instead, all I felt was a wave of clarity. No, I said simply, I have nothing to say to you. Brenda, please. I hung up. The silence after that click was deafening, but it wasn't heavy. It was liberating. For the first time, I realized I no longer feared Chris's hold on me. He could text, call, beg, manipulate, none of it mattered. Because he wasn't part of my life anymore. And he never would be again. The night of the gala, I felt like I was stepping into a different life. My life. The venue shimmered with lights, glass chandeliers scattering gold across the room. Colleagues congratulated me. Glasses clinked in toasts. My promotion had finally been announced. For years, I had been the quiet worker, the dependable one. Tonight, I stood at the center, recognized and celebrated. At my side was Daniel, my new partner. Steady, warm, quietly confident. He wasn't a poet or a dreamer. He didn't paint grand illusions with words. But he listened, he noticed, he showed up. And in his presence, I felt something I hadn't realized I'd been starving for safety without suffocation. We were laughing together when the laughter froze in my throat. Across the crowded room, I saw him. Chris. For a moment, I thought I was imagining him. The once carefree man was unrecognizable. His clothes were wrinkled, his posture slumped, his face hollowed by nights of regret and self-destruction. Our eyes met. His widened raw with desperation, and then he started walking toward me. Daniel noticed the shift in my body. Everything okay? He murmured. Yes, I said, steadying myself. It will be. Chris reached us, his gaze darting between Daniel and me. For a flicker of a second, I saw envy flash in his eyes, sharp and bitter. Then his attention locked onto me. Brenda, he whispered, voice cracking. Please, I need to talk to you, alone. I held his gaze calm. We're having a conversation, I said, gesturing to Daniel. There's nothing left to say. His panic swelled. Please, he said louder, drawing stares from nearby guests. I was wrong. I was so stupid. She wasn't who I thought she was. I want to start over. With you. We can fix this. The room seemed to shrink, everyone's attention brushing against us like static. My chest tightened, but not from fear, from clarity. He reached out, fingers trembling as if to touch my arm. I stepped back. And then in the calmest voice I'd ever heard come out of my own mouth, I answered. Chris. I began quiet, but unyielding. I don't know who you are anymore. The man I loved, the one I built a life with, he's gone. And the one standing in front of me, he's a stranger. His face crumpled. No, no, Brenda. It's still me. I can be that man again. I shook my head. That man wasn't real. He was a mask you wore until you found someone else to play with. You told me I wasn't a good person because I couldn't celebrate your betrayal. Do you remember that? He froze, shame flickering in his eyes. That night I continued, you broke something in me, and I thought it was permanent, but it wasn't. It was a beginning. Without you, I built something stronger, a life I love, a life where peace isn't fragile and love isn't a performance. I glanced at Daniel, whose steady presence anchored me. Then I looked back at Chris. In this life, I said firmly, there is no place for you. There never will be. The words seemed to drain him. His shoulders sagged, his mouth opened and closed like a man drowning. For once, he had no poetry left. Brenda, please, he choked. Just give me one more chance. We could start fresh. I stepped past him, my hand finding Daniel's. No, Chris. My fresh start already happened. And you're not in it. Together, Daniel and I walked away. I didn't turn back, but I could feel it, the weight of his stare, the silence that wrapped around him as the crowd moved on, leaving him stranded in his own wreckage. For years, Chris had been the storm that consumed me. Tonight, he was nothing more than a shadow in the rearview mirror. The last image I hold of him is not of the man I once loved, but of the emptiness he became. And for the first time, the silence inside me wasn't loneliness.